Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us on this Monday night for this panel on bisexual visibility in film and TV. My name's Cara Davison, I'm a film and TV talent development exec, and I'm very excited to be joined by such an esteemed panel with me today. I think you all know what you're in for. We're going to get real deep into the bisexual tropes and slight triumphs maybe in TV and film. A little warning, obviously some of these are going to be some harmful representation, so let's just take care of each other when we get to them and poke fun at them and break down how ridiculous they are. So we're going to have a little bit of time for questions at the end, so if you do have anything that you want to ask, keep it in mind and we'll come to that towards the end. But for now, I want to introduce our amazing panel, so we'll start off with you, Vinny.
Hey. Firstly, I just want to say I really appreciate how bisexual the logo is this year. Love that. So hi everyone, my name is Vineet Mehta, my pronouns are he, him. I'm a software engineer by day, and on the side I do stuff within the LGBTQIA+ community. I'm a public speaker and writer, and I recently published my first book, Bisexual Men Exist.
Sick.
Hi, I'm Lo Shearing. I use all pronouns. By day, I am Cosmopolitan senior sex and relationships writer, and by night, I am a bisexual activist and writer. I wrote, by the way, The Bisexual Guide to Life, and I also founded and run the Bi Survivors Network, which is a resource for bi, pan, and spec survivors of sexual and intimate partner violence.
I'm Dr. Julia Shaw. I'm a criminal psychologist and the author of Bi, The Hidden Culture, History, and Science of Bisexuality. I don't have the same claim to fame of bi activism. I'm sort of an accidental activist, but I'll be here talking about the science of it all.
I think everyone is an
Everyone's
accidental
an
activist.
I'm Lewis Oakley, he, him. I am a co-host on the Bisexual Brunch podcast, and I also run Ask a Bi Dad, which is an advice column for bisexual people.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, big up the panel. So before we get into sharing some of the clips that you've selected, I wanted to talk briefly a little bit about the role that kind of queer media played for you growing up. And, you know, we're kind of getting into what it means to see bisexual people on film and TV. And I want to kind of put to each of you, were you actively looking for bisexual representation on screen when you were younger, or maybe more broadly queer media? Was that something that you were trying to seek out, struggling to find? Was part of your own journey towards your kind of, you know, coming to terms with your sexuality? Vinny, I'll start with you.
So I think for me, I don't think I ever really sought it out. I think it was more just, as I was growing up, I started to see representation of gay people in media, especially gay men, but I didn't see bisexuality. And I think that's a really common experience for a lot of people kind of my age. I'm 30, just so away. So I think it's a quite common experience for people to just not have seen that. And I think if you sort it out, you probably would have experienced the same thing. But for me, I actually, when I first started having feelings for more than one gender, I didn't know what bisexual was. And I think the lack of education, as we all know, Section 28 stopped that, and then the curriculum was never really updated after that. Plus the lack of any kind of representation that you could just sort of stumble across kind of really hindered me ever learning that word until much later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. Lo, what about you? Were there any kind of references you were finding or leaning to, or having a similar situation?
Yeah, I think I had a similar situation. So I grew up on a farm, like deep in the countryside. And so while I knew I was like attracted to multiple genders from a young age, there was like nothing about those terms or anything. Like I went to a Christian school, so there was nothing about being gay. And so the internet was like my first foray into it. I remember, I'm sure a common experience being about 12 or 13 and typing girls kissing into YouTube. On like our family computer in the middle of the night, and then stumbling across films like, what's it, like The Truth About Jane and like Lost and Delirious, and like all of those quite old school indie lesbian films, which were like great lesbian representation, but they do not portray bisexuality in a particularly kind or nuanced way. So it took like quite a long time from there to find like some good bisexual representation.
Yeah, absolutely. Julia, what about you?
It's hard to know to see what's not there, right? So I grew up in Germany and in Canada, and I knew the word bisexual. I don't actually know where I learned it, but I know that when I came out to my mom, because she asked me, well, she said, Julia, I see you've been spending a lot of time with Sarah. And I was spending a lot of time with her. And she asked, so are you a lesbian? And I said, no, I'm bi. And I have no idea why I knew the word, but apparently I did. And I didn't know anyone who was bi in our friendship group. We did have some queer family friends, because Cologne is a very queer city. So growing up, the assumption was, which I think is an overestimation, but still the saying, that 1 in 3 men in Cologne are gay. And so my queer of anything is overtuned. I assume everyone's possibly queer, especially men. And so that gap, I think, really became, visible in its own way when I started coming out and when I started having more conversations about bisexuality more widely and as an adult. And so it's interesting to see that Cologne connection as well, because when I was doing my master's in queer history as research for the book, I went through the records, and there's this book called Sexual Inversion published by Havelock Ellis, which you're all familiar with, I'm sure. You might not be. It's one of the first ever textbooks written about, research books written about sexuality, and it includes specific case studies on bisexuality in a relatively neutral way, which is really nice. Written in the 1898, I believe, is when it was published, and it was ruled to be obscene. So it was held up in a court of law, and it was ruled to be unpublishable, obscene, taken from the shelves. And the person who sold it escaped to Cologne. And so I was like, there's always been queer people in Cologne. But yeah, although I say that, and there's definitely queer representation that I was attracted to, including tattoo.
Oh yeah.
This is not. Yeah, definitely. That was a moment.
Yeah.
Isn't one of them a queerphobe now, which is really bizarre?
Yeah.
Well, there's complications because of the Russian decriminalization. Yeah.
Anyway, off topic.
Lewis, what about you?
Yeah, I don't know how to follow that. What was I going to say? So, growing up, queer representation. So, I wasn't seeking it out because I didn't realize I was bisexual until I was 19, which, a lot of bi people tell me, I was really late discovering it about myself. But looking at the kind of queer representation, there was not much, and there was certainly no bisexuals. I mean, I was kind of the Desperate Housewives, Ugly Betty generation. So there were gay characters in that, there was a trans character in that, and then I think probably the only other queer character I can feel of growing up was Haley Cropper in Coronation Street. Yeah. But there were no bisexuals, none, just not there.
Okay, well, I mean, I think that's really helpful to pick up from that, because we're going to get into the clips now, and I guess think about the bisexuals that we have had on our screen. There's not many of them, there still isn't many of them, but we're going to kind of pick apart some of the representations that we have been given, the crumbs that we've been given, essentially. And I want to come to our first clip, and actually we'll just play the clip and then I'll come to you. So can we play the Brooklyn Nine-Nine clip, please?
So, your mother and I talked about what you told us last night.
We don't need to talk about that right now.
We want you to know we're not upset.
Great. I'm not upset either.
Because no matter what you call yourself, you still like men, so you can still get married and have a child.
I can do those things with either a man or a woman.
Yes, but it will be a man, because this is just a phase.
Talk to us.
So, interestingly, so I know we talk about, positive versus negative. For me, that was a really positive instance of a bisexual representation. And it might be what do you mean? She just got, got told that she's not really bisexual. But for me, it was the groundedness of that. For me, I felt like that was very true to life. It's exactly what I experienced when I told my mum, and she said, well, it's fine, you still like women, so you can still get married and have children and do all of that stuff. And I was like, okay, but I also didn't even want children, so why are we talking about this? It was a very interesting thing where they kind of wanted me to go down the sort of heteronormative lifestyle so they can forget about it. And so I found myself really reflected in Rosa and the way that her identity was portrayed. But more than that, I think that what really stood out for me with that is it wasn't just a bisexual person in the show, it was a bisexual person behind the scenes, just a bisexual person because Stephanie Burgess herself is bisexual. And it was her giving her input into it, it was her helping write it, helping guide it, tell her story, which I thought was really powerful. I also think having a bisexual person of colour is always great. You don't see that a lot, unfortunately. And I felt like it created a wider conversation. And so often when you have bisexual representation on screen, it's that one clip and that's kind of all you have to hold on to. With Stephanie Beatrice, it was, oh, I get to I'm writing articles about it, and I'm being interviewed by people, and I'm talking about it, and I'm at Pride, and it's like a bigger conversation than just that one clip. I also like the fact that it was a main character. I think so often when you get queer representation, especially bisexual representation, it's a box-ticking exercise. It's, oh, we put someone in there, they're in there for 3 episodes, they did the thing, we filled the box, it's done, diverse. And it's like, is it? Or you're just filling a quota? And I like the fact that she was a main character from the beginning, she came out as bisexual, it didn't just change her whole character, it became part of her identity. She had an identity outside of that. And yeah, I could go on forever, but I'm going to stop there.
No, I love that, and I think it's a really nice one to start on, because I wanted to kind of start in this kind of the coming out space, because that is, you know, the story that I think that we see most often in, all queer media, not just bisexual media, and I think that, yeah, it's an interesting one to think about, because I think it will come up a lot today, where these sit on negative, positive, and you know, you might feel differently to some of us, how some of us feel. And I think that's what's really interesting about this. But I want to pick up on the kind of core trope at the heart of that, around it kind of being a phase. And this idea that, yeah, kind of you're dabbling in bisexuality, but you're going to give that up and you're going to marry a man. Like, it's cool, fine, whatever. And so, Lewis, I'm going to come to you on this. Where does this idea of the phase come from? Like, why is that something that we're seeing?
It's a couple of things coming together, I think. I think that, on the one hand, we are a very visual species. So when people see me in the street with my 3 kids stressed out, they think, oh, straight. You know what I mean? Whereas, 10 years ago when I was with my ex-boyfriend and holding his hand, they're like, oh, there's a gay couple. So it's very hard for us to represent ourselves unless we literally are wearing like a bisexual t-shirt, which I was going to wear, but I thought, totally.
It's been a throuple.
I think that's what I think, and I'm seeing this now as a dad of 3 with 2 very young kids. It's very hard when you're kind of in a relationship sometimes and you get busy to kind of still be talking around bisexuality. There are so many other things going on. And I think that the world kind of thinks, you settle down with a girl eventually, you settle down with a guy eventually, you stop talking about it. So it was a phase, but I think there's that. And then I think, and the sometimes uncomfortable things that throw things at me is that, there are some gay men that still will identify as bisexual to later come out as gay, which no one should have to come out, so I'm not judging you for doing that, but that then does sometimes add to the stigma that's what everyone's doing. I've definitely met some gay guys that was their story, and they think that because that's what they did, that's what everyone else is doing. It's like, no, this is my destination. I've arrived, I'm here.
Yeah, 100%. Julia Lowe, do you have anything to add kind of around the phase, around this clip?
So much. There's lots of research on bi-parents and the erasure of bisexuality within parenthood. Motherhood, pregnancy is one space in which the heterosexuality is such a dominant assumption. And then there's, of course, bi dads, and when is the right time to come out? And there's lots of research on, basically, there's never the right time to do it now. According to bi dads who have participated in research, they basically say, as soon as you've done it, it's usually can be used as an educational thing to help with sort of break that down. But in terms of the phase, it's interesting that you said that it's seen as the destination, because I think from research that is still what a lot of people think, and that is used to discriminate against bisexual people. But it's also because we center monosexuality, which is people who identify as heterosexual or homosexual, attraction to one gender. That is, we don't talk about the stories of, oh, I had a heterosexual phase, or, oh, I had a gay phase, right? We don't, even though, of course, in terms of, if we are going to talk about sexuality as fluid, which is a much more accurate and honest representation of how sexuality across the lifespan usually exists, then we need to be seeing all of these as potential phases or erase that as a thing that we stigmatize entirely. So, and those coming out stories of, there are some really famous bisexual activists like Lani Kahumanu, who's Hawaiian descent and lived and works in the States. And she identified as lesbian and now identifies as bisexual. And so she had a lesbian phase, if you will, not in a judgmental way. But that's an important thing to highlight as well, that bi can also be a significant part of your life story than these other labels. But
a lot of people don't like to talk about that either. Yeah. They go, well, you go from bisexual to gay. And I know so many people who are like, I was gay, and because of the stigma, because of the fact that bisexuality isn't talked about enough, I couldn't accept that other part of myself. And eventually, when they do come out as bisexual, people think they're a traitor. They go, oh, you've gone back in the closet. Oh, you've betrayed us. Oh, you're not really queer. And it's like, what? What does that mean? But I think it really comes back to the point that you were saying about like the settling down thing. Is people always, it kind of plays into the whole idea of monogamy as well. Is people go, well, eventually you're going to end up with a single person because that's how society works. You marry a single person, you live your life with a single person. So you're settling down, you're going to have to pick one eventually. Firstly, polyamory exists, so. Secondly, some people don't like to get married, so. And it's just ridiculous. It's like it doesn't mean that you need to have a person from each of the genders you're attracted to. But that's often what people think. It's like, well, how can you be in a relationship with that person, be bisexual? Aren't you going to miss X, Y, Z? And it's like, that's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. It's not what that means.
I love that. Okay, I think we're going to stick within the kind of coming out space, and now we're going to see another representation of a coming out conversation. Can we play the Buffy clip, please?
It's complicated.
Why complicated?
It's complicated because of Tara.
You mean Tara has a crush on us? No, you... Oh. Oh. Well, that's great. You know, I mean, I think Tara's a really great girl, Will.
She is. And there's something between us. It wasn't something I was looking for. It's just powerful. And it's totally different from what Oz and I have.
Well, there you go. I mean, you know, you have to follow your heart, Will, and that's what's important, Will.
Why do you keep saying my name like that?
Like what, Will?
Are you freaked?
What? No, Will. No. No, absolutely no to that question.
So, Vineet, that was your selection. Talk to us about why you picked that clip.
Yeah, it was my selection for, and this is going to be controversial, negative. Buffy was very supportive of Willow, and that's great. But the thing that I watched Buffy growing up, and for me, it was very jarring to see someone who was very, 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 very into men suddenly go very, very into women, and then throughout the later seasons start doubling down on the fact that she is gay, she is only attracted to women and only women. And I found that really weird because for me, who was having feelings for multiple genders at the point when this stuff was happening, going, oh, so it is just one or the other. And that isn't to say that this isn't a realistic portrayal of what it could be like to be a lesbian. That some people do experience this. They are attracted to men and then they go, actually, maybe this wasn't for me. There's a lot to be said about sort of compulsory heterosexuality. But I found it really frustrating because I feel like if they actually made her bisexual, that could have done a lot for me. That could have helped me. And even in that scene, you can see that she's saying, it's complicated because I was into Oz. Oz has come back. I fancy him, but also I fancy Tara. And what does that mean? And making her bisexual, or at least mentioning it, exploring it, delving into it a little bit deeper, would have done a lot. Even if she did decide, actually, no, she's a lesbian, I think that would have given a lot of credence, or also even just helped me discover the term, because I was like, what is bisexual? I'm having feelings for multiple genders, but you can only be one, I guess. You either go from that to that, and I was like, maybe that's what's happening to me. Maybe I'm actually attracted to men now. So yeah, there's a lot of really complicated feelings that you can't really sum up with a single clip. But I found it incredibly frustrating growing up and seeing that, and especially looking back at it when I rewatched it, going, she should have been bisexual. Surely that's bisexual. And funnily enough, Josh Wheaton, who's an arsehole, we won't talk about that, but Josh Wheaton has since come out and said the exact same thing. Like, he wanted to make Willow bisexual. And when you read what he said about it, about how people were saying, you've got to make her one because it kind of looks like she's making a choice, and all of this sort of rhetoric, it really shows that the reason that he went and made her lesbian was because of biphobes telling him, it's gonna look iffy. And I think that that's been a problem throughout bisexual history, is that bisexuality is seen as a risk to the movement of LGBTQIA+. We've seen as a thing that can make it look like we can be converted or we can be changed because, well, that person decided to end up with a man, so why can't you? And it's like, it's not how it works for everyone, but also, yeah, it gets very messy. So that was why I picked that clip.
Right. I mean, it's a great clip. Lo, were you a Buffy watcher? Do you have thoughts on this clip and what it kind of portrays?
I'm really super controversial. I've never seen Buffy.
Do you want to after that?
I do want to. Like, I know I would love it. I've just never got around to it. And, you know, all vampires are bisexual allegories. But actually, on what you were saying about the way that you can tell those stories of someone really thinking they're into one gender and then realizing they're into a different one. Like, one of my favorite books when I was a teenager was a book called Keeping You a Secret. And it's about this girl who, she has a boyfriend, and then she, like, develops this crush on a girl in her school, and then realizes, like, she was never into men. And in that book, they actually have a little moment where they address, like, her girlfriend says, like, I thought you were bisexual at first, and then she says, oh, so did I, and then, like, no, I realized that's not for me. And so I think there's, like, ways of telling those stories without, like, erasing bisexuality. And that book, I think, came out in, like, the 90s, early 2000s, so, like, a similar time to this.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you know, you can tell those stories. You don't, you know, it is a common experience that there's an overlap between liking multiple genders, thinking you like multiple genders, and then kind of like really realizing what's going on later. But we can have all the representation. We don't have to like scrap for it, you know?
Yeah,
absolutely. I'm going to move us on to the next clip. And I mean, fair warning, this is like the bisexual trope bingo. So enjoy. We play the Sex and the City clip.
When was your last serious relationship?
Until then, there it was, the inevitable third date question.
Ooh. Bad question? Want to take another spin around the death rink?
No, it's fine. It's fine. I ended something a while ago. 2 years of a lot of back and forth. You know, apparently we weren't Y2K compatible. What about you?
Well, before you, there was Kayla, really neurotic, lasted a year. And before her, Leslie, couldn't commit.
And before Leslie, there was Mark.
Is that a problem?
He's a bisexual.
Well, I could have told you that, sweetie. He took you ice skating, for God's sake.
The weird thing is he was so open about it. You know, hi, I'm a bisexual, like, hi, I'm from Colorado or something.
I don't think you're allowed to be bisexual in Colorado.
Is that a problem? I mean, what kind of question is that? Is that a problem?
Of course it's a problem.
What did you say? I said it wasn't a problem. I panicked. He's such a good kisser.
You know, that generation is all about sexual experimentation. All the kids are going by.
So what, if all the bi kids are jumping off a bridge, you gonna do that too?
I'm a trisexual. I'll try anything once.
When did this happen? When did the sexes get all confused?
Somewhere between Gen X and Gen Y, they blended and made XY.
You know, I did the date the bisexual guy thing in college, but in the end, they all ended up with men.
So did the bisexual women.
Which explains why there are no available men left for us.
Oh, jeez. Maybe I do have a problem with this. I'm an old fart.
Correction, a hot old fart.
I'm not even sure bisexuality exists. I think it's just a layover on the way to Gay Town.
Isn't that right next to Ricky Martinville?
You know, I think it's great. He's open to all sexual experiences. He's evolved. It's hot.
It's not hot, it's greedy. He's double dipping.
You're not marrying the guy, you're making out with him. Enjoy it, don't worry about the labels.
You're right, you're right.
I'm very into labels. Gay, straight. Pick a side and stay there.
Hey, sister, where are you going?
Home. I've got a date with my remote control. Steve's playing basketball. That means at least 3 hours of blissfully uninterrupted alone time.
What about my problem?
Stop kissing him.
Easy for her to say.
I mean, so much to unpack.
Samantha's the only one we fuck with. Samantha, like, yeah.
Lewis, this was your selection, so I want to come to you first.
I want like a damage assessment of that clip because from a serious note, that show was so iconic, so loved by people. There were a lot of young people that were kind of, maybe not old enough to be dating or running around the city themselves that were looking at that show, kind of assessing their life and imagining when they go to the big city, it's going to be like this. So I think a lot of people drew a lot of inspiration from that show, and that one clip pretty much sealed the fate of how they felt about bisexuality for generations to come. So I think that it did a lot of damage. I think that people just listened to it and was like, oh yeah, and in the end they break up and that's it. I actually got myself in a bit of trouble. I think, was it last year or the year before, when I wrote an article, because they've obviously brought Sex and the City back as in Just Like That, and I wrote an article like, first thing, episode 1 to address bisexuality. And they still haven't. I watched their new series, and now, we've suddenly believed that she's gone from that to, she's got non-binary friends, and, everyone's kissing everyone, she doesn't matter. It's like, I don't believe your evolution. I don't, you have still got some bisexual making up to do.
Big time.
She is right that bisexual men do like ice skating though.
I mean, there's so much that you could pick out in there, and the kind of face on the way to Gay Town, and it's greedy and you're double dipping and all of this. But I think one of the things that really struck me when I watched it as well is the way that Carrie is so flippantly and he just came out and said it. She was shocked he didn't have any shame around it. Julia, I want to kind of come to you on this, and what are your thoughts on kind of the many ways in which the heterosexual women like to shame us?
So this clip, given that they referenced Y2K, I presume it was right after Y2K, so it was 2001, I'm guessing. Thinking about how recent equal marriage is, thinking about the political space at the time, the fact that they even mentioned the word bisexual is still fucking revolutionary.
Because you don't even
take note.
You don't get it today.
Exactly.
And it's shocking.
Yeah. So I feel like I do want to put it within that context, because I think, yes, there's a lot of trope. There is a back and forth. It's not just blindly accepted that this is inherently bad. And yes, I'm sure it did a lot of damage. But at least there's something. Because this was also the time when it was Basic Instinct and the duplicitous sexual succubus, and that's what we got as bi representation, was the person who was greedy, who was eventually going to kill some of her lovers if she wasn't literally a vampire. We still get versions of that in Villanelle, for example, and as you say, it can be an allegory, it can be sort of a metaphor for the sexual revolution. There's some really interesting film study stuff on that. There's a whole genre of lesbian vampire films, and there's a whole a subcategory of film studies on it, which you may or may not be aware of, but you should go look up. But with this, which trope should I pick up on?
Take your pick.
Straight woman is what you asked me about. So what's interesting is that they, in some ways, succinctly summarize some of the issues that are still around in terms of perceptions of women will go back to men, because all the women who label themselves or pretend to be bisexual are actually straight, and all the men are actually gay. And that is, to this day, the assumption that is made about bisexuality. He just came out and said it is also what people still think. And they will sometimes say it to your face, right? They'll go, "Real? How does it work? What do you mean? Can you be monogamous?" You've already touched on that, which is a huge part, especially when we're talking about dating. Hence you're just kissing the guy, so it doesn't matter. Because the one thing about especially bisexual women, which is different for bisexual men, although related, is that the thing that for straight people is more likely to be attractive, but also a risk factor for long-term relationships, is that bisexual people are perceived to be constantly sexually available. It's also the reason we're twice as likely to be sexually assaulted. So there's a real crossover here between these stereotypes and dating scenarios, stigma that you get on the ground in those moments, and then the subsequent responses like sexual assault against people who are queer, and I'm comparing bi to people who are lesbian or people who are straight. So this has real knock-on effects way beyond the screen.
The thing that I wanted to pick up on was the whole always go back to men, because it's something that I write quite a bit in my book, because it's this concept of phallocentrism, and I guess warning, because it's very, very vile, I guess, but the idea of phallocentrism is the whole fact that when you are penetrated by a penis, it alters you. It changes your being, your state, and your attraction, your experience, your whatever you want to call it, to the penis, like summarizes your identity. And so what that ends up meaning is because bisexual women have had sex with men, they are straight women, and bisexual men have had sex with men, makes them gay men. And it shows up in a lot of, like, with the whole sort of no bisexuals trope that we saw with Willow and the whole straight to gay sort of thing. I actually experienced that myself when I watched, it's an awful show, it was one of the other clips that I mentioned that they couldn't get hold of, but it was this clip of 90210, the remake. Awful show. Loved every second. Awful show. And there was a character in there called Eddie who was like the most like promiscuous man. He like entered the scene and somehow trumped all the other promiscuous men. It was like, I have sex with all of them plus times, like just insane. But yet suddenly slept with a man, and my friend was convinced, one of my uni friends was convinced that he's now gay. And I'm like, but he had sex with all those women. How does he gay? And it's like, well, you can't come back from that. And that's how people often see it, is you've had that sexual experience, you've had that, and you can't remove yourself from it. And it comes up in a lot of different areas. Think about why straight women in society are often seen, virginal straight women are often seen as pure, because when you've had sex, it changes you, it alters you. And so it runs in a lot of different areas of our society, and the way that it plays out with bisexuality is we always go back to men.
And sex is a penis, which is why sex is rape. And without a penis, you can't be raped.
Yeah, which is a whole law thing that you can go into, but yeah.
Anything to add on Sex and the City, Lo, at this point?
I mean, I have Carrie Bradshaw's job now.
Yeah. I was going to say, you are the Carrie Bradshaw.
In this reboot, they gave Carrie Bradshaw blue hair and pronouns. But so we are doing better. But like Cosmo's doing better, sex writers are doing better. But man, that clip is just like, they just run the gamut. Like, you can just imagine them in the writer's room. Like, we have to tick all of these off. Like, how can we get through them in the dialogue?
So imagine that writer's room. It's just like, yes.
But yeah, I agree with like the damage control. Like, that was probably like a lot of the first time that people had seen the word bisexual on TV, and especially when you look at the amount of bisexual men on TV, and especially in like the early aughts, that was like kind of it, right, on like representation, and it's that offensive and that. And again, it's the difference between like bisexual women are erased and bisexual men are predators, and like they're just hitting both of them in one clip.
Like, I think the Glad Where We Are on TV report from like 2013 says that there was only about 3 bisexual men in that whole like season of TV, which is crazy because it's like, that's 2013, that's 10 years ago, and that's not that far. And then you go back to like Sex and the City, and you're right, that was probably the only time it was like bisexual man. It's like, and they go straight through of saying that he's not bisexual constantly.
Yeah, exactly. So we're gonna go on to another savage clip. Could we play the Scrubs clip, please?
Oh no.
Todd, you were impressive in surgery today.
Thanks, man. You were really impressive in the shower this morning. You know, dong-wise.
Todd!
What?
Stop it! The whole point of coming to grips with your sexuality was to accept yourself and stop being that guy.
I'm sorry. This whole change is just scaring me. I'm not sure who I am anymore.
Come here. Get over here,
Oh.
sweetie. Oh, I know. Let it out. I'm here for you.
What
the hell are you doing?
Motorboating. You know, I really gotta thank you gals for outing me. Chicks dig gay dudes. Hey, Lisa, I heard you lied and said we didn't do it. Admit it, we doinked.
I was sad because my dad died.
I wasn't.
So this whole thing was an act? Oh my God, I cannot believe that I let you in that fitting room yesterday while I was trying on bras.
Ew.
That was a very special time for me.
Unbelievable. We saw the girls.
Oh, it's cool if you want to walk away, ladies, because I love to watch you go. Nothing wrong with those. Nothing wrong with that either. Or that. Or that.
What the hell are you?
I'm the Todd.
So, Lo, that was your selection. Can you talk us through why you chose that clip?
Yeah, I think similar to Lewis's, it manages to just like run the gamut of like all the tropes about bisexuality. That was actually, so when I was a teenager, I was obsessed with Scrubs, and that was like the first time that I'd ever seen like multi-gender attraction, if you can even call it that, like represented on TV. And it was just like, oh my God, we're terrible people. Like our attraction to multiple genders means that we're just gonna fetishize them and sexualize them, and everyone's gonna be like weirded out by us. And again, it like really plays into that trope that bisexual men in particular are predatory, they can't be trusted, they're faking it to get to women, which is a weird like trope that existed for a while.
Yeah, weirdly, that one doesn't get talked about enough, but it's interesting.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
And just, I don't know, like, whenever I think of bad representation, like, this is the one that just always comes to mind for me. I mean, props to him for saying he doesn't have to label his sexuality, he's just a Todd. If we're going to give it, like, 1 point, we're going to give it that.
My sexuality is Todd.
Yeah. But apart from that, like, and again, that's the whole, they don't even manage to say the word bisexual.
Yeah.
So it's both erasing it and portraying it as this, like, dangerous, predatory, creepy thing.
It's that sexually promiscuous trope taken to such an extreme. It's like, I will literally fuck anything that's on two legs. Sometimes not even, like, I'm sure there's, like, references later in the show where he, like, fucks someone who's basically on their deathbed or something like that. It's very much like, I will fuck anything that moves and even things that won't. It's like, think about the sort of, like, Casanova trope of, like, Joey from Friends, but times a million. It's a little grim.
Yeah, because that is, like, a short clip of, if anyone's seen Scrubs or was obsessed with it like I was, that is, like, a running joke all throughout, like, the whole series, that Todd is this kind of creepy, perverted guy, but is also gay. And they kind of, I mean, it's also, like, a homophobic clip as well, because they're saying, well, this gay man is overcompensating for his gayness by being weird and creepy to women, which, you know, was a stereotype in, like, the early 2000s, and I probably still exists now. So it was managing to be both, like, biphobic and homophobic at the same time.
And if there is any humor in it. So, I mean, he does have skulls literally on his... So if there's any, like, not so subtle representation of the baddie, it does feel like it's him. Which, that doesn't work, though, if you're in a society at a time when there isn't already widespread conversation about that sexuality and positive representation. And so it's the same with the vampire stuff, where it's like, in some ways, you're allowed to have this negative representation and the nuance and the jokes about, like, how this is the epitome of, like, a bad version of this, if there are other characters available to you. When this is it, that is no.
Yeah. And I wanted to pick up on, you know, you mentioned in there around this idea that this man is using his sexuality just to also get into women's spaces, essentially, which is so damaging, so harmful, so familiar today as well in lots of ways. I mean, Lewis, I'm going to come to you on this one. Why are they doing this? Like, why is that something that we're kind of forced onto bisexual men specifically?
I just think people just didn't understand it. So, like, well, you must be lying and it must all be a ruse to get near women, I think, the trick you were talking about before. I think the thing about these last few clips as well, they're all sort of that early noughties time. And I think we all sort of forget that there was no Netflix. There wasn't all the thousands of options, watch anything, anytime you want. It was, you know, a couple of channels, and there was only so many things. So I feel like these things are really hardwired into people because there was only like 4 or 5 things to watch. And so when you've only got those few nuggets of really bad representation, I think, you know, it's a different world now. You can watch whatever you want. You could probably just spend your whole life watching just queer films if you really wanted to. But I think that's something that's really stood out to me is, my God, there was so little on offer, and that was all we got.
Yeah. That was one of the biggest sitcoms of, like, I think it was like late noughties even. So it's like the whole of the noughties was just bad time all around. But yeah, it was probably one of the biggest sitcoms of its time.
I think it's really lovely to think now that, like, this was the first time I saw bisexuality on TV, but particularly bisexual men on TV. And for young people now, like, Heartstopper might be the first time they see bisexual men on TV. And it's like, we've come so far, and we have a long way to go, but it's just, like, really nice to think about young people who are coming out now seeing those much nicer representations of themselves.
Yeah.
And we will definitely come on to that a little bit later. Can we play the next clip, please? The Lucifer clip.
It was an amazing night.
But the next day, Lucifer was with another woman. So, did that make you jealous?
Jealous? Why?
Well, because he basically used you for sex and moved on. Did that bother you?
I knew what I was in for.
And what were you in for?
The best night of my life.
The best night of my life.
The best night of my life?
The best night of my life.
The best night of my life.
You know, this is actually feeling a bit masturbatory, even for me. Though clearly not the words of a killer.
He knew exactly what I wanted.
And he did this thing?
He did this thing. He even did this thing with a pan flute and a butternut squash.
I was improvising. I didn't have any zucchinis.
He did this thing with my Tibetan singing pot and artisan honey.
It's a game I play called Do I Make You Horny, Honey?
With some Vaseline and a car battery?
What? Oh, it's a move I call Gentlemen Start Your Engines. It's bloody brilliant.
Love it. Lewis, this was your clip. Talk us through the selection.
It was. So obviously there are a couple of issues with it. But I think for me, at the time I found it, this was the first time I'd seen male bisexuality portrayed realistically, and kind of like, even though it's over-sexualized and he's clearly a slut, but that was fine, so was I. I think
You saw yourself.
Yeah, I saw myself. And it was something to have. He is a main character leading a main TV show. He's, you know, well-dressed. He's unapologetic about it. He's not kind of there... Because in this scene, he's basically... They realize that the killer is someone he's slept with, so they have to interview everyone he's slept with. And he's not kind of there, like, trying to hide the man from, oh my God, they're going to find out. He's just there really unapologetic, talking about sex tips. And I just kind of really connected with that unapologetic bisexual stuff. It's not perfect. I don't think he ever says the word bisexual in the whole series. But for me, in that moment when I watched it, I was like, yeah, he's confident with it. He's not apologizing for it. He's well-dressed. And so what, he slept with a lot of people.
And I think that is a really interesting clip, especially in parallel to the last one we watched as well, in terms of that kind of over-sexualization of bisexual men. And I think this one's an interesting one, because I think you're right that it does sit on a...
He's also the devil as well.
Yeah.
So.
There you go.
So, like, what part of it makes him good at sex?
Yeah. But I think also the clip is kind of played for laughs as well, in a way.
Yeah.
Vineet, I was to come to you just as you're taking a sip. Thoughts on the Lucifer clip?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you that it's... that we're not the butt of the joke this time. It's like, yeah, he's overly sexualized, and yeah, he's slutty and promiscuous, but we're not the joke. And I think that that's a big shift from Todd from Scrubs, where it's like, it's the joke of him just being like a gross guy. And it's like, he isn't a gross guy, he's actually like quite a suave, quite a interesting, quite a like sexy guy. But yeah, I think it does obviously fall into a little bit of the tropes of like being promiscuous. I think the problem with it is that it almost becomes slightly fetishistic. I think you see this common trend now, which is really weird, where there's a slight shift from bisexual men to like, yes, bisexual men. And it takes that idea of, well, they're more in touch with their feelings, they're more this, they're more that. And it's like, we're just people. Can we just be people? Like, it's this constant painting with broad strokes that is just frustrating. It's like, first you've gone from the negative ones, and it's like, yay, positive. But also, could you just remember that we're people? And a lot of people have written about this and spoken about it, that it can be quite dangerous because there's almost these expectations put on us. And it can lead to stuff like sexual assault as well, in a similar way to how bisexual women tend to get sexually assaulted is because they're almost fetishized, they're objectified. They're going to provide this fantasy to men, and it can be very dangerous. And I don't think we're there with men, but I think that those do play into that narrative. But all in all, I'm like, yeah, give them sex tips, it's great.
And I think it brings up an interesting point around kind of representation more broadly, and like where the line between representation and like tokenism sits. Julia, I'll come to you on that. Do you have any thoughts around kind of what makes that difference essentially?
Tokenism versus representation. I mean, one is having bisexual people in the writer's room.
Yeah.
Or coming to events like this. And learning and engaging with bisexual people. And we've seen, I mean, obviously there have always been bisexual people in writers' rooms, they just weren't necessarily able to be out. And we also know that people sometimes overcompensate for not wanting to be outed by engaging with discriminatory statements and other things. The tokenism, The best way to tackle it is visibility. So in my book, I have a whole chapter called The Bisexual Closet, which is all about how few bisexual people are out even to their loved ones. So among people who identify as LGBTIQIA+, Q is sort of a umbrella, but also within it, which I always think is the queer is all, but also its own thing. But within that, we know that bisexual people are way less likely to be out to their loved ones. They're way less likely to be out at work than other identities. And so there's a question there as to why, and why is that still the case when we are seeing more representation on the screen? We're seeing more representation in pop culture in particular. One of the answers is we are not seeing more representation in the workplace. We are not seeing more representation in professions. I think I might be the only criminal psychologist, for example, in my field who's openly bisexual. And I now know that there are quite a few of us because people come and tell me in private that they're bi, but they still wouldn't say it to their students or their colleagues. And that means we're not making space for bisexual people. And so in terms of tokenism, that is only overcome when we can see each other. And that helps, and to see each other, you need to come out. And this is where it's sort of this catch-22, where basically if you feel able and safe to do so, I always recommend people come out because we know that that leads to social change. Also because the people who already love you and know you, most of them probably, even if they're annoyed initially or have a weird reaction like in Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and say, you'll probably end up with a man in the end, you can change their minds. And you're most likely to change the minds of the people who already love you. And that has a ripple effect, because now they know a bisexual. And now if they see representation, they might stand up for bisexual people. Never mind the fact that if you come out on, for example, social media, you might be reaching hundreds of people at a time, and you don't know who's out there, who is waiting to see someone like you, who's saying, I've never seen someone like me represented in my field, in my job, in my space, and you can be that person. So tokenism can be overcome with encouraging people to come out, and that's why things like Bi Visibility Day are so important.
I was just going to say, because I'm very sad and I've memorized statistics at this point, and just for context for people, bisexual men, only 14% of them are out to everyone in their family. If you compare that to gay men, it's 59%. Bisexual men, only 46% of them aren't out to anyone in their family. Like, the contrast is astounding, and there's reasons for that. And I think you're right, like, visibility really does go a long way to help fixing that. Because every time I've come out in a space, I have other people who are like, you know what, I think I might be. And I know so many people who have said to me, like, with my hashtag or in person or at events like this, who've gone, after I went to this, after I met you, after you spoke about this thing, I came out. And there's so much power in it. There's so much power in saying the word, which might bring us quite nicely to the next clip. There's so much power in saying the word. Before we do that, I want to do something. You can obviously not participate. Do we have any bisexual people in the house?
I love that for all of us. Okay, great. We're going to go on to the next clip, which is Schitt's Creek.
So, just to be clear, I'm a red wine drinker.
That's fine.
Okay, cool. But I only drink red wine.
Okay.
And up until last night, I was under the impression that you too only drank red wine. But I guess I was wrong.
I see where you're going with this. I do drink red wine. But I also drink white wine. And I've been known to sample the occasional rosé. And a couple summers back, I tried a Merlot that used to be a Chardonnay, which got a bit complicated.
Okay, yeah, so you're just really open to all wines.
I like the wine and not the label. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Okay. This is just very new to me, so as long as you didn't roll over and cry yourself to sleep with regret, then we're good, right?
No, I absolutely did that. Just wept for hours in the dark. I say we go with this one, it's the biggest.
Julia, that was your clip. Talk to us why you selected that.
Well, for one, it's a great Canadian show. Filmed about an hour from where my mom lives. So I don't know, how many of you have seen Schitt's Creek? has it crossed the ocean. I had a very strong, what's called parasocial relationship with the characters in Schitt's Creek. Now, research on parasocial relationships is really interesting, especially when we're talking about queer representation in film and TV, because what a parasocial relationship is it's when you feel like you know the characters personally. You feel like you've developed a relationship with them. You know, they're your friends. And I very much had that with Schitt's Creek. And I feel like, oh my God, ew. Like sometimes I am Schitt's Creek. But anyway, so to me, having representation like that in a show where I feel like these are almost people in my life. These are people I joke about with my partner all the time. It's like they're friends. And we know from research that that is a powerful effect that can really help to change social values and what we sort of see as contact with groups that are different from ourselves. So the fact that my mom watches this show, for example, means, and she also has this parasocial relationship. She also feels like these are people who she can relate to, who are part of her life, much like friends. And so when these kinds of conversations happen within that context, it has a much more powerful effect. It's like a friend of yours coming out and you going, oh, interesting. And so it has the ability to change minds. And so it's one of my favorite pieces of research when it comes to changing, well, specifically using representation in TV and film to actively change discrimination and violence against queer people. It's that there's strong research that shows that it works. And that the more, in some ways, you want to give people a bit of time to get to know the characters first, and then you have even more of a chance of introducing identities and sexualities that are less conventional without having people reject them off the bat. So overall, I loved this, and I lost my shit a bit when I saw it. But what is the crucial omission in this clip? Nobody says the word bisexual, and nobody ever says the word bisexual or pansexual or plurisexual or bisexual. And none of them. Nobody says any version of bi. This is it. They just let it hang. And it's like bisexual is a dirty word. And there is a book called The B Word, which is all about representation in film, which is now a bit dated because it came out a while ago. But it also talks about this, like, there's this evasion of the word, the actual word bisexual, as if it's a swear word. And that shouldn't be the case. And it's starting to change, but it's not changing fast enough. And you don't need to have it in the same exchange. You can have it somewhere else, that somebody else mentions about the character. Oh, yeah, he's bi. That would be fine. Or pan, which is what the person who's playing it, Levy, is that his name?
Yeah.
Jason? The actor is actually pansexual in real life. And the character is also pansexual, as was later discussed in sort of information about the series, and yet that's never mentioned. And that has saying words like pan. My mom still doesn't know what pansexual means, and using those words and saying, oh, it's often a synonym for bi, but some people see it as a separate identity. That is really important, and they missed that opportunity to include that educational moment. So there's good and bad in this, and overall, that parasocial relationship, though, I think is really good in Schitt's Creek, and it can help to destigmatize things.
I think that's why I like Rosa and Brooklyn Nine-Nine so much, because they said the word multiple times. It was like, yes, they said it. There's nothing more frustrating when they just miss the word. There's nothing more frustrating, because I think the problem that can happen, I think this one tends to be quite clear-cut for most people, but for some shows, when they don't say the word, it leaves things open to interpretation. And as we know, when you leave things open to interpretation, you get erasure. The one that we've spoken about before, actually, is The Good Place and Eleanor. And she shows so much affection to Tahani. There's even a moment where Tahani is like one of her partners, and it's like, she's clearly sexually attracted to her, but they never say the word. And when they don't say the word, so many people would look at that and be like, oh, it's just, sometimes girls find other girls attractive. That's normal, that's okay. And it's like, but she's bi. Surely that's bi. And the problem is when you leave things open to that interpretation, people aren't going to see it the same way. And so it's like, is it bisexual representation or is it not? And some people will say yes. And a lot of people, especially those who are outside the B, outside bisexual, pansexual, M-spec, will see it differently. And therefore it hasn't had the impact on them. It didn't teach them what pan was or what bi was. It didn't teach them that was a thing that exists.
And the way that they dealt with that, as far as I could tell from The Good Place, is they just gave her a bunch of rainbows. Just like occasionally there'd be like a rainbow sweater, and it's like they're trying to work with the visual language of queerness.
And it's like, God forbid you just say a word. Jesus.
I think it's really interesting, especially around like what you're saying around changing minds of people, but then also, I guess, not saying the word and choosing to tell stories in this way, like we're pandering to a straight audience. And so where is the kind of, what good does that do, really, for queer people, bisexual people? Lo, I'll come to you.
I mean, I'm so glad you started us on that conversation, because that is literally why I chose the clip that I chose that we're about to see, that these teaching moments are great and they're really important, and they're really important for young queer people. But I feel like we've definitely got to a place where like that's all we're getting, and we have to have this like very wholesome, clear-cut storylines. And that, again, that's really important for like teaching moments, but that's often not true to life. Queer people are messy, queer people are morally grey, queer people are bad people sometimes. And I just like wish we could have more of that nuanced representation.
Surprise, bi people are also just people.
We're also just people, nuanced, messy, and yeah, I just want more of that representation as well.
Oh man, I have a true crime podcast called Bad People, and whenever one of the serial killers is bi, I'm like, no!
Damn it! No!
We've done it again.
Well, I think that leads us on nicely, so let's play the clip from Jennifer's Body.
Why do you need him? Huh? You could have anybody that you want, Jennifer. So, why Chip? Is it just to tick me off? Or is it because you're just really insecure?
I am not insecure, needy. God, that's a joke. How could I ever be insecure? I was the snowflake queen.
Yeah. 2 years ago when you were socially relevant.
I am still socially relevant.
And when you didn't need laxatives to stay skinny.
I am going to eat your soul and shit it out, Nikki!
Thought you only murdered boys. I go both ways.
So yeah, Lois, expand for us on why you chose this clip.
Firstly, I forgot that she gets skewered right after saying that. I'm so sorry. That was slightly more graphic than I remember that being in my head. Yeah. Welcome to my TED Talk on why all horror is queer. This is my favourite bisexual film because it takes the tropes about bisexuality and turns them up so high that it just like subverts them into this, I think, really like cheeky and fun satirical like idea of us. And it feels like it's written for queer people. Like Karen Kasuama, I might be saying her name wrong, apologies if I am. She is a queer woman, and she, like, it is written as a queer film. In the original script, there was a sex scene between Needy and Megan Fox's character. And just, like, what is more relatable as a young bisexual teenager than being like, what if I got rid of my friend's boyfriend because I feel really weird and close to my friend and don't know what to do about it? So I love that. I love the, like, again, we talked about, like, vampires being such a queer allegory. The idea of, like, bi women in particular being, you know, succubuses, being, like, so hypersexualized. And then this just takes it to the extreme that, like, she's a literal man-eater in the film. I also love as well that Jennifer's Body is a revenge fantasy, not just a revenge fantasy about sexual violence, which given that, you know, so many bi people are survivors, I think that's like that plays into it a little bit for me. But also I think like queer representation can also be, if you fuck with us, we will eat you. And that's what I think Jennifer's Body does really nicely, so that's why I picked it as my, and like the I go both ways is just so funny. I think it's brilliant. Chef's kiss.
And Megan Fox is bi.
And she's bi, exactly.
I think sometimes making us the villain is really powerful because it does show that like we have a lot of power, and it does make us people a little bit scared of us, and it's like you should be.
Yeah.
Lewis, any thoughts on the Jennifer's Body clip, and I guess how our stories are progressing in some way as time moves on?
I've never seen it, but I'm definitely going to go and see it now. You sold it to me. It sounds great. How it's progressing. So obviously I think that, you kind of look at those early 90s where it was, not talked about at all, only to really ridicule it and to hear. I think one of the things that sitting on this panel has, I didn't expect to feel was actually quite sad. I was starting to think, I literally loved Charmed growing up, and there were, I think there was one queer character who was, an extra once. And I was just thinking about, what that would have done for me to have had a character in there, if only for, a story arc that had been bisexual. And it's not just about what that would have done for me personally, but I watched that show with my nan, and my nan died before I really figured out that I was bisexual and got the chance to come out to her. And I think that, sometimes having media can have those conversations for us that we just aren't ready to have. But actually, there was a queer character here, or there was a bisexual here, and my nan or my auntie said, oh, that's lovely. And it's that then or it can sometimes be a springboard. So, I mean, the power of film is what's really coming out to me. Is oh my God, can you imagine if they'd have just been nice to bisexuals? Where could we have been? Ruling the world.
Also, imagine making witches straight. I'm sorry. What world do you live in that witches are straight? Wake up.
I love that. Well, hopefully we can bring a little bit of queer joy to everyone with our last clip. Can we play the Heartstopper clip, please? Julia, talk to us why you chose that clip.
Because it gives me goosebumps. I think it's a great clip to end on because it feels like a party at the end, which is where we've arrived. It is one of the most recent representations on screen of bisexuality, and I do think it represents how far we've come. So if we look at the noughties, which obviously we were focusing on sort of the noughties in the 90s because that was our childhood and those were our fundamental experiences. I mean, anyone who's older than us will say, wow, the noughties were so much better than the 70s and the 60s and the 90s, where it was all, well, the 80s in particular, the rhetoric around so the vectors of AIDS, and so the gay man is the sort of devilish figure, and the bisexual is the one who's bringing it to the straights. So, I mean, there's all these really horrible rhetorics that if we go back further and further and further, you see in different ways. And there's always been queer joy as well. Which is, in fact, why Hollywood had to, in the 30s, go, no more queerness in Hollywood, because that is sex perversion, and we don't want that. Because, turns out, Hollywood's always been pretty queer. And so there's always been representation of sexual diversity and diversity of sexual identity on screen, whether people wanted it or not. And so from the 30s to the 60s, it just went underground, and it all went into the glances, it went into the subtext, it went into the implications, it went into coded language and the villains, because you were allowed to have negative depictions. Exactly. And so seeing that trajectory from there being in early Hollywood this representation that was then intentionally suppressed, also as laws changed and criminalized homosexual behavior, and then it kind of coming back in the 60s but tempered, and then where we are now, it has been an absolute revolution in representation. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, because it's easy to say, where are all the bisexual people? And it's just as easy to say, where are the bisexual? Yeah. And it's just as easy to say, there's no books on bisexuality. Hey, yes there are. Or there's no queer representation in people who are singers or people who are academics. And it's like, no, there is some, and we should praise and value the representation there is rather than pretending there is none. Because otherwise we end up doing what Carrie Bradshaw says and basically saying, I think it's just a trend. Isn't bisexuality what all the kids are doing, which is literally something we still hear. And that has never been the case. The 90s, I mean, this was after the 90s. The 90s was when LGBT plus activists fought to get the B included in the March on Washington. It was literally fought, and they agreed that they could use the word bi but not bisexual because sex shouldn't be in the term. So that is within our lifetimes that these conversations have happened. So I think queer history, taking it through film, taking it to where we are now, we should be very proud overall, but there's still a lot to do.
I was just going to pull up on that last part you said about the phase and the trend of like young people. Like the most frustrating thing that I found with the recent census data is everyone focusing on the like 16 to 25-year-olds. They identify, more of them identify as bisexual, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, people have been saying that for years. That isn't new. And every single time it comes up, eventually it goes down the path of like, it's the trend, it's the phase, it's the sexual experimentation time. And no one is focusing on the fact that like you see it in the 25 to 34 and the 35 plus and the 40 plus and the 50 plus and the 60. There was bisexual across every single age demographic. And even queer activists are not talking about that part. And I'm like, you're focusing on the wrong thing. I want you to focus on the fact that we have always been here. And it's the problem when you get non-bi activists, whether it's straight or LGBTQIA+, talking about our issues instead of giving us a platform to say, actually, the thing that we should be focusing on is we have always been here, and that's what we want to talk about.
To give some credit to the news, I was literally on BBC
yes,
talking about exactly that.
Like, them giving you a platform is great, but I've seen like gay activists, for example.
Yes,
I'm not going to name names, but gay activists talking about that, and I've replied back and was like, focus on this part instead, because I think that's more important.
Love that. So before I hand over to you for some questions, I have one last question that I would like to put to all of you. And it is simply like, I think it's really lovely that you kind of bring us into the history there, Julia, and I want to look ahead. And what is your kind of like dream for bisexual people, bisexual stories on screen? Like obviously more, we know that, but what is something that you're really hoping to see and that you've been like searching for, reaching for, you just want to kind of feel that? Lewis.
I would like to see some boring bisexuals. Just someone that their bisexuality is established, but actually the storyline is about them like fighting a huge case in their law firm or whatever, or they're saving their town from being built on or whatever. But I think that it's, you know, if you're bisexual, then that is the main thing. And I think that actually having some boring bisexuals on doing anything interesting is important. I also think some of the big issues that seem to kind of affect bisexuals actually being explored. So the reason I started an advice column was because so many people were emailing me and so many of the things were kind of similar. And I was like, you know what, I should just stop publishing these and then people can help themselves. And one of the main ones is, you know, a bi man coming out in his 40s or 50s to his wife or wanting to, and it going horribly wrong. I don't think I've ever seen that on television, where it's like, a man comes out to his wife of 10, 15 years, like, you know what, there is something that I've always hidden, and I've only really come to terms with it now, is that I'm bi, I don't want to leave you, I don't want to cheat on you, I want everything to say so, I just want you to know. And she's like, let's get divorced. Because I want people to kind of empathize with some of those things. And that's just one example, but there's so many other things that are, even the isolation. I think that so few bisexuals, that we're all lucky, but I think that there are so few bisexuals that know other bi people in person. I think that obviously the internet's connected a lot of people now, but a lot of people are bi and they don't really have any other bi people in their family or friendship groups to really turn to. And so then they're kind of at the mercy of gay and straight advice, which can be hard. So I think it would be really nice to have some boring bisexuals, and then in other instances, just kind of really getting under the skin of, you know, some of those specific bi issues that are good. But ultimately, like, the more the better. And I don't mind a couple of bad representations of bisexuality, just so long as it's not the only ones.
Yeah, of course. Julia?
the connectedness to the community is an interesting point. So there's lots of research which bears that out, which shows that bisexual people are least likely to be plugged into queer communities. Never mind bi communities, but queer communities at all. And I mean, we can probably all echo that. It didn't occur to me until recently that I was queer, as in that the rainbow flag is for me. It didn't even cross my mind, which is a problem. And I know that is changing in terms of how we talk about these things. But the community aspect of then seeking that out and saying, this is a space for me, that is something that we still need to work on. And we know that not having that leads to loneliness, isolation, leads to increased levels of non-suicidal self-injury, leads to all kinds of negative psychological outcomes, which is why for a while people actually thought that people who are bisexual are more likely to be mentally ill. And they're like, oh, is that because being bi means you're mentally ill? No.
Biphobia exists.
Yeah. Biphobia makes me very sick. But it is that. It is the consequences of living on the margins of society in some way. And it's not just like bisexuals aren't the only people who are marginalized who understand that. There's lots of crossovers, of course, with other marginalized communities. In terms of, what was your actual question?
What's your dream? What do you want to see on screen?
Oh, what do I want to see? I want to see researchers on screen. So I, in general, think there's a complete lack of focus on how sexy scientists are.
You're talking about yourself.
Actually, though, I mean, ideas are sexy, and people who have clever ideas are sexy, and we should celebrate that. And so rarely are there positive representations of scientists or researchers on screen. They're often super cliched, if at all. And so I think that can change, and I think when we're talking about queer history, we're getting more representation of gay history, we're getting more lesbian history, we're getting more trans history, we're getting even more non-binary history, I think, than bi history. And I mean, I've yet to see any films on bi history, which takes me to the point where I'm currently writing queer historical fiction. But genuinely, I think that there are lots of ways to bring bisexual-centered researchers and research from the archives into effective fiction and nonfiction storytelling that you could be exploring. And there are lots of archives around the world that have now gone digital, especially because of the pandemic. And you can just email people and say, hey, I saw that there's this bisexual researcher who I found on Google Scholar, which you're obviously all very aware of, and I would like to see some correspondences that you have listed in your archive. And they will photograph them or scan them and send them to you. I did a digital visit to the Havelock Ellis collection. They will just open the boxes on camera and go through it with you. You don't even need to go there anymore. It's amazing. So as my gift to you, there's lots of queer history out there, and it's easier to get at it than ever before.
On a related note, if you haven't heard of the Pipe and Library,
Oh, yeah.
like, my book would not exist if it wasn't for the Pipe and Library, because I was like, I don't know how to get these books. I'm like, I know, it's in my bookshelf. I'm just gonna, here you go, and just read out stuff to me and photocopied it. Anyway.
It's a website. Pipe and Library is a website.
Yeah.
Flo, your dreams?
Yeah, forgive me if I'm misremembering, but apart from Rosa Diaz, all of the bisexuals, whether they say it or not, in these clips we've just seen were white, were cis, were able-bodied, and we know from looking at the demographics that bisexual, pansexual, M-spec as like a bucket has like the most amount of people of color of any demographic of queerness. It has the most amount of trans and non-binary people of any of like the queer demographics. The majority of like trans people identify along like the spectrum of bisexuality. We also know, although there's like much less research into it, that there's a really big overlap between like bi and disabled communities, bi and chronic illness, bi and mental illness. And yet like the only representation we get, or the majority, is like white, cis, mainly female, like able-bodied. And not only is that like not true to life, but it also creates this idea that bi people are all just like white, cis, able-bodied people. And I think this is like part of where this like bi people are all privileged and, you know, don't face the same issues comes from, because all of our representation is so like boxed in basically. And so my dream would be not just more bisexual representation, but much more diverse bisexual representation.
Yeah, I was gonna say obviously bi people of color, because being a bi person of color, like, I can't tell you a person that I've seen on screen that like actually represents me. I've never seen a bisexual Indian man in anything, so that would be my first thing. I want more nuance. I don't want to criticize Heartstopper because I think it was great and there was a lot in there that was great. And I think for the demographic it's targeting, it was perfect. But I want the nuance of like, you know, he kind of has this date with, I think her name is Imogen, the girl that like everyone keeps saying that he's in love with. I would have liked to have seen him go on a date with her and actually go, you know what, I do kind of fancy her, but I fancy Charlie more. But obviously it's a young adult thing and it's very one true pairing kind of thing, so I understand it. But I want that more nuance. I also want, in general, for us to move away from coming out stories and trauma. I think that there's always a space for that, and I think it's really important. I think it's important to represent coming out and our history and all of that stuff. But I also want our bisexuality to exist as just a part of our identity, rather than the wholeness of our identity. We can be queer vampires and witches and pirates and all sorts of things. We can exist in horror things as both the villain and the hero. We can exist as superheroes. You know, I want us to exist in a way where it's not just bisexuality, that is our identity, that is all of it. We are actually very varied people. And the whole thing doesn't have to be, oh yeah, bisexuality as a pirate, and the biphobia was the real enemy all along. Like, enough of the allegories. Like, why can't it just be that, like, you know, it's Peter Pan or something, but also Peter Pan is bisexual, you know? Why can't we exist in that way, in the way that white, cis, straight men get to exist? Yeah. Why can't I exist in a way where I'm just a person first and foremost, and I have a varied life, and the things that I have to go through is not all about my sexual identity.
I like the way you said we are not just like all bisexuality. On a panel of people where like
Shut
our
up.
whole thing is and, like everything we talk about.
I'm very aware of this. Like, there's a reason for that. Gatekeep, but in a positive way. Like, say this is a fund or this is a grant that it will only be for bisexual people. So you need to be bisexual if you want this dough. You know, like, and I don't think that's a hard thing to do. I think at the end of the day, bisexual people find it harder to enter things. We're more likely to live below the poverty level. We're less likely to be out. There's reasons why we aren't accessing this stuff. Reach out to networks as well. There's a lot of bisexual networks out there. Meet up with them. Advertise it in those spaces, because if you advertise it in LGBTQIA plus spaces, as Julia touched on, we're not in those spaces. A lot of us don't think that those spaces are for us. Again, I remember statistics. 50% of bisexual men aren't out in queer spaces. Does that shock you? Because it should. 50%. That's a lot of people, right? And if they're not in those spaces, and that's where you're going to find them, you're not going to find them, right? You're just not. So I think that that's a really good place to start. Go to the bisexual organisations, reach out to them. Go to Bi Pride, London Bisexual Network, Bi Survivors Network, Biscuit. There's so many of them.
There's an example of the worst case scenario of doing that, which is in the mid-90s, just before AIDS treatments became more accessible. There was quite a lot of campaigning for saying, hey, actually, we've got some treatments. You should come see your doctor. You should get tested. You know, if you're HIV positive, that can be a real risk to your sexual partners. And all of that messaging, even though it did include, so there's sometimes, I think, false critique and ahistorical critique that it never included bi men. It did, in fact, include a lot of messaging about bi men. But where did they put it? They put it in queer spaces. They put it in gay bars. They put it in the spaces where gay men who are seeking sexual activity with other men in a very specific way. They didn't put it in the parks. They didn't put it in normal magazines. They put it into these specific locations, and it was disproportionately missing bisexual men. So I think that that's a sort of warning story of like, this can go really wrong even if you have good intentions, and so making sure you're targeting the right people.
And that's still being done today. Like, even to this day, a lot of the messaging is within queer spaces for HIV and AIDS, and so we're still missed. It's called, I won't go into it on this panel because we're run out of time, but it's called the cycle of invisibility, and it's like if you're only researching in those spaces and only targeting those spaces and you're only finding out what the problems are in those spaces, then you're going to lose a lot. So, yeah. Read my book.
Thank you. I think the main thing, though, is creating the characters, because I would want to work on a project. It's like, oh, the protagonist is bi. I want to put myself forward for that.
Yeah.
I feel like that's part of it.
Yeah, and stating it.
Yeah.
I don't think we state it. Like, I don't want to rag on BFI because they're paying me, but like I only found it in one thing on the whole of the brochure. And I get that you want to make people go to a lot of different things and you don't want to put people off, but if I'm going through it and I'm like, I want to see some bisexual stuff, and I can only find it specifically in one film in the whole brochure, then I'm like, oh, maybe there's just no bisexual films. And that's not true. They're in all the other stuff as well, but it's not advertised now.
One of the things we actually talked about doing on the podcast, and we have a lot of ideas that don't always get off the ground. We don't even have our mugs yet. But we talked about, should we get a load of bisexuals together and basically put together a bit of a handbook of different bisexual characters and different bisexual storylines? Because clearly, and I know I'm at BFI, but there is a lot of reboots and remakes, and bisexuals can help with that, with really like new stories I promise you have never seen before. So we were kind of like, wait, should we put it all together and get loads of bisexuals together and like put this thing together and just send it to loads of production companies and be like, you know what, if you're like struggling, here you go, have them for free. We have not done that yet.
Also, don't do it for free, get paid.
We're starting this discourse, are we? Okay, queer baiting is not real. Real people can't queer. Real people can't queer bait. Real people can't queer bait. Queer bait is a term. Actually, you can go into it because you talk about what the term means.
All right, put this on me. Yeah, like the term queer baiting was originally about fiction, right? And it was specifically about Brokeback Mountain is the like queer bait. Actually, I've got that the wrong way around. Brokeback Mountain is straight baiting. If you've seen like the original posters for Brokeback Mountain, it was like the main characters with their wives, and then a load of people like went to see it thinking it was a cowboy film, and then they're like fucking in a tent within like 15 minutes. Amazing. But yeah, so queer baiting is a term that's like when they do a kind of will they won't they with like same gender characters, and then never actually like follow through with it. Originally because, and we've talked about like how streaming has changed queer representation on like terrestrial networks. When they were like distributing this representation, it would be a lot harder to like distribute it into different countries and different territories with like these queer storylines in it. So they were kind of hinting at these queer storylines for kind of, you know, certain audiences, and then not including them so that they
Looking
could
at
still,
you, Disney.
Yeah, so they could still like sell them in other countries. Where it's being applied to like real people, and I think there is something to be said in kind of like people like Ariana Grande. She is a person, but she's also a brand.
Yeah.
And there is something to be said in like the marketing of these people. But I feel like a lot of times when celebrities are being accused of queer baiting, especially like Kit Connor, who was recently forced to come out, it is kind of people having a very monosexual focused idea of what queerness is, that your queerness is like validated by these like same gender relationships. And if you express queerness in another way, if you're saying I'm queer but I express my, you know, I'm in a different gender relationship, or I'm not in a relationship, or I express my queerness in those kind of ways, then you get accused of queer baiting.
I want to pick up on the Kit Connor one, because that was the one that frustrated me the most. Is where it really came to a head. The advertising for the Hearts of... I didn't know about the advertising. I only heard about it and then I watched it. But apparently the advertising was very much queer characters playing queer people playing queer characters, and they're kind of linking them all up with the character. So it's like a trans woman playing a trans woman, and a bi person playing a bi person, a gay person playing a gay person, so on, so on, so on. And so the thing with Nick and Kit Connor was it was a bisexual man playing a bisexual man in the show. So now tell me why, when he was pictured with a woman, people said he was queer baiting. What does it mean? What does bisexual mean? Can we reiterate that? And yeah, it got so vile that he was forced to come out and say, I'm bisexual, because he had never stated it outright. And I'm like, how do you call someone out on queer baiting when they're pictured with a woman? And it just shows that bisexuality is only accepted to a point, and bisexuality is only seen as bisexual if it's a certain way. And the second that he was pictured in a non-queer, is how they see it, non-queer relationship, suddenly it's, oh, you were queer baiting the whole time, you were trying to sell stuff to us, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no, still bisexual. Still bisexual. And it just becomes a very vicious way of people trying to attack and it does become very biphobic.
One of my favorite papers that I came across in the research for my book is research on Brokeback Mountain, and it was a film studies researcher. It was a short piece saying, "It's not a movie about two gay cowboys. It's a movie about two bi shepherds."
They are shepherds.
That was the whole piece. It was great. It was just a takedown as to why they're bisexual.
And shepherds. That's
And
also
shepherds.
important.
Coming back to the idea that I mentioned earlier, right, of being a traitor. Like when someone goes from gay to bi, it's like, oh, so you're going back in the closet, you're a traitor, you're abandoning us, sort of thing. I haven't watched Chasing Amy, but it does bring me to a show that I've only watched half of because I'm terrible, called The Bisexual on Channel 4, which I don't know if anyone else has watched. But it kind of goes into the same thing, right, where she is at the beginning of the show, she's a lesbian. And then she she has a thing with a man, and it's kind of like, oh, what does this mean? And all the community kind of rejects her, and she has to go through all of that, of where is my space, where's for me, all of my friends are lesbians, I've entrenched myself in that space, and now I have nothing. Biphobia is a huge thing in LGBTQIA plus spaces, and people like to say, no, we're all accepting, blah, blah, blah. I don't think it's any worse than outside society, but I think it hurts more, because you think that it's a safe space and go, oh, not here too. Okay, cool. And I think that the problem is our community is a microcosm of society at large, and all the same things exist in our community that exist outside of it. And the reason why it keeps existing is because I don't think, I'm going to slag off the whole community here, don't think our community does enough to unlearn the stuff that society teaches us. We don't do enough to understand the variety of the people that exist within our community. And at what point does our community no longer a community? Because a community is supposed to uplift and support each other. And does the community do a good enough job at doing that in the variety that exists? I will say I've experienced racism in our spaces. Is our community doing enough to tackle that? I don't know.
I think it's always a bit of a shock for people that are maybe not in the queer space to understand that bisexuals can be rejected in the queer space. People are like, what? But it happens. I remember, back when I years ago was with a guy, and I would say to my friends at the time, I am bisexual, but they'd never seen it. And then when I was single again, and I always remember this one night where I had met a girl in a bar, and we were kissing, and that was it. I didn't think anything of it. And then the next day I saw the WhatsApp with all of my gay friends, and they'd taken a picture of us kissing. It was like, a gay guy being seduced in Soho, disgusting. And all these horrible comments. I was just like, guys, come on. Like, that's so outrageous. Like, that's just not cool. And even yesterday, someone messaged me saying, there are bigger issues you should be focusing on. And I was like, I'm in the bi space, I focus on bi issues. There's a shit ton going on in the world, but this is my little contribution over here. And the fact that you think that you have the nerve to say to me, there are bigger issues, it's like, why can't all of the issues be the same? There are enough of us in the queer community that, okay, we'll do this over here, you do this over here, we'll meet in the middle tomorrow, and we'll go over it, we'll give each other, support.
I mean, if you want to talk about bigger issues, let's talk about the fact that bisexual people are more likely to be suicidal, more likely to self-harm, more likely to have anxiety and depression, more likely to be diagnosed with late-stage HIV, more likely to be sexually assaulted than gay and lesbian people. If we want to talk about bigger issues, let's talk about bigger issues, because there are bigger issues than just visibility. Visibility is just the start. Once we get the visibility over the line, it's like, okay, cool, now let's talk about all the problems due to the lack of visibility and the discrimination that we face, because there's problems.
Just one other thing your question made me think of that we might not have time to deeply get into, but I think that, there is obviously a stereotype, right, around bisexual people. They can't be trusted, they could never be happy with one, they blah, blah, blah. I actually, in what I've seen, I don't have statistics on this, but we obviously have the statistics about how much more likely we are to receive abuse in a relationship. I actually do think that we really need to look into, it's one of the things we probably need more funding and more research into, is bisexuals staying in a relationship that's wrong for them because they're scared of losing all the other identities that go with it. Because if you are a bisexual person in an opposite sex relationship, then leaving that relationship also means your chance to have biological children, your chance to get married in some countries. There's a lot that goes with it. And on the queer side, if you are in a relationship with someone that is maybe the same sex, you could lose all of that kind of identity in that queer space if you come out of that relationship. So I actually would love to delve a lot more deeper into, do bisexuals stay in relationships because they're scared of it's not just your partner you lose. You lose that whole identity.
I think that we have come to an end. We've run out of time, but that was...
Dog, no.
Play the heart
I can end on a happy note, a related but happy note.
Yeah.
So the term for that is double discrimination, when you get it from both the queer and the straight community. Some of my favorite things that bisexual people have been called in queer spaces is sexual spies. Because we're obviously spies, especially in women's spaces, especially when we're talking about like feminist movements and the intersection with queerness. The women who also are sleeping with men are sleeping with the enemy. Yeah. So we're bisexual spies sleeping with the enemy. Fence sitters, of course.
Switch hitters.
Switch hitters is good. Yeah. There's a lot of references to cake, having your cake and eating it too.
What's wrong with that? Cake's cake. I mean, I don't like cake. Let's talk later.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing, guys. You have been so brilliant, and it's been an entirely insightful panel, so thank you. And thank you to our audience for your questions. You have also been brilliant, and I'd just like to end on giving them a real big round of applause.